What if I tell you that in next conflict with Pakistan, Indian pilots will be shot down by the same fighter jets that was made in India? Today it is encouraged by Atmanirbhar Bharat. If New Delhi itself suffered from external powers arming our neighbors Pakistan, then by same logic I would say, should India be supplying advanced weaponry to other states? India did not invade another country, nor did it supply arms to fuel conflicts elsewhere.
You are listening to 93.9 Dublin South FM.
So, in next conflict with Pakistan, Indian pilots will be shot down by the same fighter jets that was made in India. Sounds impossible, but then it is a serious probability. Today, India is manufacturing wings for those F-16s using Lockheed Martin partnership with Tata's. We should not forget that it was the same F-16 which shot down our brave pilot Wing Commander Abhinandan Varthaman in 2019. And currently, with renewed Trump and Pakistan friendship, there is a great possibility that the new batch of F-16s that would be delivered to Pakistan will have made in India wings, and that they will be shooting at our Indian Air Force. With that, I come to the topic of today's discussion that my dear friend Alok inspired me to research and to make a case to the rest of us Indians and let them know the ethical dimension of defense exports by India, the newfound love of this government. Since its independence in 1947, it has carried the weight of civilization, heritage, moral philosophy, importantly, and a global identity which was rooted in peace, non-alignment, and anti-colonial struggle. Unlike those empires that rose through conquest or industrial economies built on colonial extractions, India's legitimacy in world affairs has rested on a different foundation. The very idea that justice, non-violence, and self-determination can serve as true currency of international influence. So for decades, this identity remained relatively uncontested. India did not invade another country, nor did it supply arms to fuel conflicts elsewhere. Indeed, it was one of the founders of non-aligned movement which sought to keep developing countries away from the rivalries of the Cold War. Remember that? This movement was not just diplomacy, it was an ethical stance. On the other hand, while United States and the Soviet Union were amassing nuclear stockpiles and supplying weapons to their client states, India was articulating an alternative vision of a world not governed by those blocs, the NATO or Warsaw Bloc, militarism or arms race. Yet, India of 21st century seems to be drifting from that path. Today it is encouraged by Atmanirbhar Bharat and it's a ambition to become a global manufacturing hub. Nothing wrong in that. But then India has now emerged as one of the top 25 defense exporters in the world. Its defense exports stands at $2.6 billion in year 2023-24. Which was a meager 1,500 crores, about $200 million just about 9 years ago. And the current government has declared an ambition of $5 billion in annual defense exports in this current year. Now these numbers may look impressive in an economic survey, but they raise fundamental questions. Can India still claim the mantle of peace-loving nation if it builds its economy and global influence on the sale of lethal weapons? Is it not walking the same path once trodden by the powers we criticized as Indians, the United States and Britain, all of which became complicit in wars far from their own borders because of their arms industry, because of the war industry? The moral dilemma becomes sharper when we recall India's own bitter experiences. For decades, we in India had opposed the United States' supply of F-16 fighter jets and military equipment to Pakistan, and India was arguing that it destabilized South Asia and tilted the balance of power. India's entire defense strategy was based on how Pakistan was getting arms from US and the other countries. India also consistently raised concerns about China's military assistance to Pakistan, including strategic military support during the recent Operation Sindoor. If New Delhi itself suffered from external powers arming our neighbors Pakistan, then by same logic I would say, should India be supplying advanced weaponry to other states engaged in bitter territorial disputes? And for that example, Armenia, who is in conflict with Azerbaijan, or the Philippines in its confrontation with China over the South China Sea. Now, this contradiction is at the heart of my objection to the current defense export policy of India. The principle that this government and as country we must be consistent. If arms exports to rivals harm India, arms export by us Indians can harm others. So how have we moved from Gandhi to guns? And to understand this shift, we must situate India's arms export in its broader political and economic context. Until 1990s, India's defense industry was largely state-controlled and import-dependent. And exports were negligible, just limited to very low-end equipment for surveillance or law and order to countries like Nepal, Bhutan and Mauritius. But then came the 1990s liberalization, and that is where the economy changed, but not immediately. The real decisive shift came in 2014 onwards, particularly under the Make in India initiative. The government sought to build a domestic military-industrial base to reduce dependence on imports, because India was world's second largest arms importer for decades together. And also, the government wanted to generate employment through defense production. Therefore, export promotion became a natural corollary. If India was to scale production, it had to find market abroad. And thus was born the rhetoric of India becoming major arms exporter or defense partner to other nations and eventually a global supplier, 25th largest exporter. So various policy came, but then the government in 2022 announced a milestone. Philippines signed $375 million deal for BrahMos cruise missiles, marking India's first export of much advanced offensive system. It was celebrated domestically as a diplomatic success, but it will contribute directly to the militarization of the South China Sea. India, by this step, is inserting itself into the Philippines-China conflict, and India risks antagonizing Beijing further while trying itself to overcome the disputes on our northern borders. And if at all these missiles were ever fired in anger by Philippines, India's name will be attached to the consequences. Armenia has purchased Pinaka rocket systems, Swati radars and artilleries from India, and it is in conflict with Azerbaijan. Now, by supplying these arms, India has placed itself squarely on one side of a volatile conflict. How? Because this supply will reverberate back to India's relation with Turkey and Pakistan, both of which back Azerbaijan. In effect, India has traded short-term profits for long-term diplomatic complications, and these complications have direct impact on the Kashmir solution. So, the same logic India once used against US arms to Pakistan, that they destabilized South Asia, now with Indian export, it applies to Armenia. Similarly, India has exported Hermes 900 UAVs drones to Israel via the Adani-Elbit joint venture. Although these exports are claimed by the joint venture to be as non-combat and only for surveillance, but we do not know. There are no documents and there are no oversights to clearly establish that these equipments were not used as a lethal weapon. So with all these, what gets lost in this success narrative is the ethical and the strategic cost. India, by promoting such exports, is now contributing, embedding itself into a conflict which is nowhere near its borders. India takes an indirect responsibility for how those weapons are used. And this is not abstract moralism. It is a matter of global perception and domestic consequence. How? Just as Microsoft and Google and other tech firms face scrutiny for all their technologies being misused in conflict like Gaza, India too will face scrutiny when its weapon cause casualties in wars elsewhere. And the world today holds not just armies, but also their suppliers accountable. Therefore, the debate of India's emerging role as arms exporters cannot be fully understood without looking outwards. The world has seen time and again how nations that deepen their dependence on arms trade become hostage to what the US President Eisenhower famously called the military-industrial complex. India is walking into it. And he warned in 1961 farewell address that there is a dangerous, unwarranted influence of defense industry over national policy. 60 years later, this warning is proving to be prophetic. United States has war as business, and US is the world's largest exporter of arms, accounting for roughly 40% of global arms transfer. And then there are companies like Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of F-16, parts of which India is making. And in fact, it was just about to sign a contract for making F-21s and newer F-16s in India, the whole aircraft. Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and they generate billions and billions of dollars annually. And these dollars have so much of economic weight, it creates a cycle that political leaders begin to justify wars and military alliances purely to sustain the profitability of these companies. US cannot see Lockheed Martin go bankrupt. US cannot see Boeing go bankrupt. So we have witnessed the conflicts in Iraq 2003, Afghanistan right from 2001 to 2021, and of course the ongoing flow of weapons to Ukraine and Israel. They all demonstrate one thing: the dynamics of political leaders to justify war and military alliances. And each war has its own purpose. It's a marketplace for weapon testing, for procurement and replenishment. And then it also gives a very malicious phenomena of revolving door between the Pentagon and the defense corporations, where the army generals retire to become defense contractors and lobbyists for foreign interventions that ensure there are continuous orders. So US is in a state of permanent war just because of this cycle. Same is with British BAE systems, and they have repeatedly been accused of bribery and corruption in securing arms deal from Saudi Arabia. In fact, during the Yemen conflict, Britain continued to export weapons to Saudi Arabia despite overwhelming evidence that they are being used in bombing campaigns that killed civilians. And it took British judiciary eventually to force the government to review the contracts. But then the moral damage is done. We have seen conflict of interest by tall leaders, or let's say politicians like Dick Cheney, who had interest in oil industry while US was at war in Iraq. For that matter, Tony Blair, my favorite terrorist, who entered into lucrative consulting and advisory roles, and some of them were linked to states that purchased British weapons. Now he is talking of a transition authority in Gaza-Israel conflict. So the conflict of interest with these leaders and top politicians is natural when it comes to war industry. This is a reality of arms trade. They all become salesmen of war. But then India is at an early stage of this process. But the signs are worrying. If you had observed, there was an enthusiastic promotion of India's private defense sector by our political leaders, even during ongoing military operations like Operation Sindoor. And these signals the merging of war and commerce. This is not normal, but it clearly shows the trend and what's going on in the background when India is trying to enter into a war industry. It is just not about exports. Karma comes back. The American gun problem has a warning. The American public pays the cost in blood and treasures while the defense contractors are making profit. It's beyond the foreign wars. The United States today suffers over 360 mass shootings annually and a level of domestic violence unparalleled among developed nations. In this sense, the military-industrial complex not only fuels war abroad, but it continues to corrode peace at home also. So the question we need to ask, does India, a country with far less wealth and a very different moral history, does India want to replicate this model? Not now, but gradually in another 10 years, 15 years down the line. India still has a deeply ingrained cultural ethos of restraint, family and non-violence. But the expansion of private defense industry for export could open up the cracks. Private security firms, insurgent groups, and criminal syndicates may one day access the very technology designed for India's military exports. Today, our children in India play in the grounds, in the parks, without fear, but soon will have to be watched by parents wielding pistols as they do in Israel. Our watchmen, chowkidars, have nothing lethal, whether it is an open neighborhood in Delhi or gated society in Mumbai. Even Indian bank branches don't have an armed security guard, except that one of them, an elderly gentleman, he would carry a symbolic World War II double-barrel rifle. But next thing will be armed security personnel manning the gates of the society with sophisticated automatic weapons. Why? Because they are easily available in the domestic market. And once that line is crossed, rolling back will be impossible. So let not India become a mini America with its ambition to become $5 billion defense exporter, and thus we are on the path to erode the moral capital. For decades, continuously, the world has admired India as land of Gandhi, a champion of non-violence, a voice of developing nations seeking peace rather than militarization. If India now becomes another arms merchant, it risks being lumped with the very forces it once criticized. And people of India are known to be peace-loving, hard-working, and globally admired for their education and enterprise. But if they are increasingly tied to war industry as workers, investors, taxpayers, innovators, then symbolically they will have blood in their hands. And that transformation would be a profound betrayal of India's ethos. India currently has an enormous comparative advantage in industries that promote peace, like pharmaceuticals, education, information technology, renewable energy, agriculture, space technology. And these sectors create jobs, they generate positive exports, and it enhances India's global image without bloodshed. So there is no need for India to choose the dangerous path of being arms merchant. But then, with the dangerous development in the neighborhood, India's future does not lie in rejecting defense modernization altogether. That would be unrealistic and unsafe. Defense manufacturing and procurement should be for making our borders secure. That's it. Instead of supplying weapons, India should position itself as a mediator, peacekeeper, and conflict resolver. Switzerland has been the destination for peacemaking. How about India being the new Geneva? Why aren't our politicians and leaders thinking about those policies? I was inspired by few personal stories. So this is my German friend whom we fondly call Magnificent Mel, and she was once faced with a choice. A recruiter approached her with what seemed like a perfect job just 15 minutes away from her home. The convenience, the stability, and the balance of family life, everything was aligning. Yet there was a catch. The company was a defense manufacturer. And what my friend did, without hesitation, she turned down the offer. Instead, she chose a life of greater sacrifice, waking in the freezing darkness of German winters, battling snowstorms, traveling an hour and a half in the train, leaving her 2 children behind. She carried that burden for years, all because her conscience would not allow her to profit from an industry that thrives on death and destruction. Her courage became contagious. And inspired by Magnificent Mel's example, given the opportunity, my wife too made a difficult choice. She declined a lucrative offer from Britain's BAE Systems, who was offering a package promising much higher than her current salary. Financially, it would have been an obvious step up, but morally, it was a step down. And like Mel, my wife too took peace over profit. So these are not grand gestures that make headlines, but then it's a quite resolute choice that shape the moral fabric of our world. Individuals can stop wars because it is the people who lend their talent and labor to this war industry. Every time someone refuses to be complicit in the manufacturing of lethal weapons, a small fracture appears in those war machines. A bullet less is made, a life less is lost. And this is the lesson that we can resist war. India must also resist. Like these 2 women, India too faces a stark choice. It can chase the illusion of power through arms exports, joining the ranks of nations whose wealth is stained with blood, or it can embrace a higher path like it did till this time, using its ingenuity and industry to promote peace, sustainability, and human welfare. If India joins the arms export race, then it may be rich in weapons but poor in peace. It may be admired for its arms but mistrusted for its motives. But if India chooses the latter, it could redefine global leadership for sake of history, its people, and humanity at large. India must resist the seduction of war industry and remain true to its timeless ethos that peace, not arms, is the highest form of strength. Thank you for your patience. With those thoughts, I leave you until next week. Stay safe, stay informed, and dutifully ask questions. Bye for now.
You are listening to 93.9 Dublin South FM.